Professor Capra, it's such a privilege to be able to speak to you like this. Your work has influenced me for decades. I read your first book, is it The Tower of Physics?
The Tower of Physics, yes.
Right, back in the 80s. So
Yes,
I never imagined at that point that I would be able to speak to you face to face like this.
Well, that's very nice. And the wonders of modern technology make it possible.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which is an example of creativity, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yes. So I did your course last year about the system.
Yes, I remember you very well. We had a number of exchanges.
Thank you.
And the Capra course, I'm happy to tell you, is going very well.
That's great.
I've taught it now 5 times, and we have between 150 and 200 participants every time, all around the world. So it's a wonderful experience.
That also is an example of creativity, isn't it? That you've created something from nothing, basically. And
Absolutely, yes.
So let me start by asking you, I mean, I've read your views on creativity in your books, but let me just as a way of introduction ask you by just defining creativity in your point of view.
Well, for me, creativity is the capacity to create novelty. This may be new shapes in art or design, new ideas, new approaches to problems, whatever the novelty is, the ability to create novelty, to me, that's the very essence of creativity.
Okay, and a lot of academics, they would argue that there has to be value as well. It can't just be novelty, because if there is novelty, originality, and there is no value, there's no benefit or usefulness, then we can't really call that creativity.
Well, I would not agree with that. First of all, let me say that in my work, I extend the notion of creativity to all of life, not just to human life, but to all of life. And let me elaborate on this a little bit. As you know, over the last 30 years, I have developed a synthesis of a new conception of life that is now emerging in science. It's a synthesis that integrates the biological dimension of life with the cognitive, the social, and the ecological dimension. And concerning creativity, one of the key insights of this new conception of life, which I call the systems view of life, one of the key insights is that the mind is fundamentally embodied, which means that our mental activities, thoughts, feelings, and so on, are fundamentally shaped by our bodily experiences. This is how the mental or cognitive and the biological is integrated. And concerning creativity, the biological roots of creativity are to be found in a process known as emergence. This is a process that has been recently discovered, and let me very briefly explain it to you. As we know, living organisms have a great stability. They maintain themselves in a state of homeostasis, which keeps them very stable. But every now and then, such a living organism may encounter a point of instability where they either break down or, more frequently, they break through to a new state of order, new structures, new behavior. And this breaking through, the spontaneous emergence of new forms of behavior or new structures is known simply as emergence. And that has been recognized as one of the hallmarks of life. It is the basic dynamics of development, of learning, of evolution. In other words, creativity, the creation of novelty, is inherent in all life. It's a key property of all life. So, you know, I expand this concept. And when it comes to human creativity, you can add all kinds of considerations. But for me, creativity is much larger, applies to all of life.
Okay. And from my interviews, I've noticed that, you know, there are various approaches that people are taking to creativity. For example, there are some who focus solely on the psychological aspect, the cognitive problem-solving abilities, the thinking, divergent and convergent thinking. And there are others who focus very much on the biological aspects, and they think about, you know, the importance of relaxation of the body, etc. And others who look at the socio-cultural aspects of creativity. So do you think that there is a, you know, I mean, your theory is a way of synthesizing these different approaches?
Right.
But, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Right. Because as I said before, cognition and biological structures are closely related. In this systems view of life, we see cognition as the very process of life. So the biological structures in which this process takes place, the brain and other structures in the body, the biological structures are the expression of matter, and the cognitive processes that operate within these structures are the expression of mind. So matter and mind have a relationship of structure and process. That's a very novel and profound integration of, you know, biology and psychology. And then when it comes to humans, we also have not only cognition but consciousness, which is self-awareness, conscious lived experience, and which includes language and conceptual thought. And as soon as you have language and conceptual thought, you go into the social domain, because language is a means of communication. It's a social phenomenon. And therefore, at this point, the social aspect of life is integrated with the biological and the cognitive. So this is a very integrative view. And I'm sure these various theories of creativity can be integrated into this framework.
Okay, and then we think about the, if we look at the philosophical perspectives and the role of the unconscious, which I know I've had communications with you previously about in my view, systems thinking doesn't totally acknowledge the role of the unconscious.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, so do we need to rely on psychology for the role of the unconscious, or is there new thinking on that aspect?
Well, you see, this theory of cognition, which is known as the Santiago theory of cognition, that sees cognition or mind as the basic process of life, is very recent and hasn't been fully developed, or let's say it has been fully developed, but it hasn't been applied to many things. And in particular, when it comes to consciousness, how conscious awareness, self-awareness, emerges from brain activity or other bodily activity, that problem has not been understood. And therefore, at this point, the systems view of life cannot tell us anything about the human unconscious and its actions. And I think, you know, frankly, you're better off with Freud and, you know, other psychologists than with the systems view of life.
And Freud wrote Civilization and Its Discontent. And that focuses a lot on the destructive aspects of the unconscious, because people talk about dreams, imagination leading to creativity, and not all our dreams are life-enhancing dreams.
Of course, because our lives are not always smooth. You know, we experience traumatic events in our life, and as is well known, Freud concentrated on childhood traumas and the effects of childhood traumas in later life. So this is a very rich body of work.
And when you wrote your book, The Tao of Physics, you described your experience on a beach. I think it might have been in Brazil, was it? Where you...
It was in California.
Oh, it was in California, was it?
Yes.
And so that was an example of, you know, what people talk about, images, dreams, and that led to your creativity. You transformed the culture in terms of how we view science through your writings, but it began with an image.
That's right. It began with an image, and it began with a meditative experience, and for me it was a kind of epiphany, because I had been trained as a physicist. I knew a lot of things about atoms and subatomic particles, about cosmic rays coming in from outer space, impinging on the atmosphere, creating and destroying particles. And I knew, as I was sitting on that beach, that the sand, the water waves, the rocks, all these were made of atoms, which were made of particles, and that all these particles were constantly in motion. And I had read passages in books by physicists which talked about a dance of energy, a dance of matter. And I also knew that in Hinduism, there was this iconic image of Shiva Nataraja, the cosmic dancer, the king of dancers. But in that epiphany, that all came alive. And I experienced, I sort of saw, not literally, but in a way, this cosmic dance happening around me. And that led me then eventually to write this book, The Tao of Physics.
Right. You see, as you speak, you remind me of famous characters, famous leaders from our history who, using the biographical approach to creativity, they describe sudden experiences like that where everything spontaneously seems to be synthesized. Yes,
I can also, speaking of biographical dimensions, I have come to trust my creativity as a writer. And this trust was not always there. When I was a young student in Vienna, in Austria, I wasn't sure of myself at all. In fact, I wasn't sure whether I was smart enough to become a physicist. And then with time, I got more self-assured. And when I began to write, I eventually came to trust my creativity, so that I can at times almost watch myself being creative. You know, I have a certain ritual when I write. I prepare a certain context, a space in which I write. I have certain processes I go through, and I know that when I do that, then at a certain point, things begin to flow and the creativity emerges. It's a really great experience. And I think we can all train ourselves and practice that trust in creativity. And I think the results of the systems view of life, that we now know that creativity is not limited to artists or poets. All of us are creative. And not only all of us, you know, our cats and dogs are creative, and all animals, all plants, all life is creative. So creativity is a very basic property of all life.
Right. And through reading some of your other books, I know that you cite many examples where you just happen to be in the right place at the right time. You've experienced lots of synchronicity, serendipity, lucky encounters.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that comes from being sensitive and aware to what's happening in your environment. So when I write, writing is not a 9-to-5 job. The book or the ideas go around in my mind all the time, day and night. And so I become very aware to anything that might be related to my work in my environment, in people, in things I read, people I meet, sometimes, newspapers lying around, and I glance at them and I see something, and I find that it's related to my work. And I've acquired significant information in this serendipitous way.
Right. And what about the process of evaluation? Because, you express your creativity, but it needs to, your books need to be socially evaluated before they get published.
Of course. Now, let me first say that this emergence of novelty, which we associate now with creativity, is not a conscious process. So it's not a rational process. It involves the entire mind and consciousness. But then, as you rightly say, it needs to be evaluated. So rational thought comes in, judgment comes in. And this is why I also disagreed with what you said earlier, that creativity needs to have positive values. I think creativity for me is just the capacity to produce novelty. Whether this novelty is useful or not, acceptable or not, ethical or not, is another question.
Okay, right. So yes, but the general consensus in academia, it's not I believe that creativity is much broader than even having originality and value, but the general consensus at this point in time seems to be amongst academics that it needs to fulfill the criteria of value and originality.
Yes, well, originality definitely. Value, maybe that's another conversation.
Yes, I mean, I have noticed that a lot of entrepreneurs, for example, they believe that something needs to be only valuable. It doesn't have to be original. In the personal development industry, for example, a lot of entrepreneurs are repackaging knowledge that is, derives from ancient wisdom, but it's repackaged in a new way. So it fulfills the criteria of originality, but it sells. Oh, I mean, sorry, of value, and it sells.
Yes. All right.
Final remarks then, Professor Capra.
Pardon?
Final remarks, just to conclude, what do you think we need to be thinking about in terms of this emergence of creativity?
Well, I think it's a very positive development to know that creativity is out there, is abundant, and just needs to be allowed to manifest. In education, for instance, that's very important, to realize that children, students are naturally creative because they are alive. And so the trick is not to make them creative, but to sort of channel their creativity into learning, into producing things that are useful and so on. But creativity is there. And I think that's a very positive and a very hopeful development.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Professor Capra, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you through the conference and through the Capra, the alumni network that you've created.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure.
Okay, speak to you soon. Bye for now.